I bid you welcome.
To a new world of gods and monsters.
How do you like that, eh?
Even a man who's pure at heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the moon is full and bright.
I love dead, hate living.
It's a perfect night for mystery and horror. The air itself is filled with monsters.
Dracula, the Wicked Darling, the Unholy Three, the Mystic, the Unknown, London After Midnight, West of Zanzibar, The 13th Chair, Freaks, Mark of the Vampire, The Devil Doll. A handful of the classic films directed by the vastly unique Tod Browning. Best remembered for directing Universal's 1931 horror classic, Dracula, Browning helped usher in the golden age of horror in Hollywood. But Browning's life is far more interesting than just the vampire film that would forever shape the pop culture image of the vampire. Much like the sideshow performers in his 1932 magnum opus, Freaks, Browning was an outsider. Yet it was that very position that elevated the artistry of his body of work. His visions were wild and haunting, but perhaps more relevant than anyone at the time realized. Much like the classic American author, whose name was lent to Browning in many press releases, he could take the dark side of a story and shine a light upon it, no matter how uncomfortable it could be. Tod Browning was often cited as the Edgar Allan Poe of cinema. I'm Ian the Wolfman, and this is the Monster Archives. Charles Albert Browning Jr. was born in Louisville, Kentucky on July 12, 1880, the second son of Charles Albert and Lydia Browning. Charles Sr. was a bricklayer, carpenter, and machinist. They were a middle-class family and Baptist. Browning's uncle was baseball star Pete Louisville Slugger Browning, whose nickname was bestowed upon the iconic baseball bat. Much like his uncle, Browning was a nonconformist within his family and would struggle with alcohol from a young age. As a child, Browning was fascinated by circus and carnival life. At the age of 16, before completing high school, he ran away from his well-to-do family to join a traveling circus. Browning was initially hired as a roustabout, a worker with broad-based, non-specific skills. Typically, they handled material for construction on fairgrounds. Soon, he began serving as a barker, or spieler, at sideshows. By 1901, Browning was performing song and dance routines for Ohio and Mississippi Riverboat Entertainment, as well as performing as a contortionist for the Manhattan Fair and Carnival Company. He developed a live burial act in which he was billed as the living hypnotic corpse, and performed as a clown with the Ringling Brothers Circus. Much of these experiences inspired his films later in life. In 1906, Browning was briefly married to Amy Lewis Stevens in Louisville. Around this time, he adopted the professional name Tod Browning. Tod is the German word for death. Browning soon abandoned his wife and became a vaudevillain, touring extensively as a magician's assistant. He appeared in a Mutt and Jeff sketch in the 1912 burlesque revue, The World of Mirth, with comedian Charles Murray. In 1909, after 13 years of performing in carnivals and vaudeville circuits, Browning, at the age of 29, transitioned to acting in film. His first work was as a comedic actor in director Edward Dillon's short films. Browning was a slapstick actor, and this experience would lend itself to his own career as a filmmaker. In 1913, Browning was hired by film director D.W. Griffith at Biograph Studios in New York City. He appeared in Griffith's 1913 film, Scenting a Terrible Crime, as an undertaker. The pair departed Biograph and New York the same year, moving to Hollywood and joining Reliance Majestic Studios. It's difficult to pinpoint Browning's first one-reel directorial debut. One film historian attributes a number of one- or two-reelers to him from 1914 to 1916, while another credits his debut to the one-reeler drama, The Lucky Transfer, which was released in March of 1915. Browning's career nearly ended when, intoxicated, he drove his vehicle into a railroad crossing and crashed into a locomotive. Browning suffered serious injuries, as did a passenger, actor George Seigman. A second passenger, actor Elmer Booth, was killed instantly. Many historians note that Browning's alcoholism and the after effects of the accident would shape his thematic obsessions and creative outlook. David J. Schall and Elias Savada note that a distinct pattern had appeared in his post-accident body of work, distinguishing it from the comedy that had been his specialty before 1915. Now his focus was moralistic melodrama, with recurrent themes of crime, culpability, and retribution. The 31 films that Browning wrote and directed between 1920 and 1939 were, with few exceptions, melodramas. Browning's injuries are what most likely attributed to the end of his acting career. During his recovery, he turned to writing screenplays for Reliance Majestic. He joined Griffith's film crew on the set of Intolerance in 1916 as an assistant director, while also appearing in a bit part. The following year, Browning wrote and directed his first full-length feature, Jim Bloodsoe, for Fine Arts Triangle Film Companies. The story was based on a poem by John Hay, a former personal secretary to Abraham Lincoln during the American Civil War. That same year, 1917, Browning married his second wife, Alice Watson. They would remain together until her death in 1944. The duo returned to New York that year, where he directed films for Metro Pictures. One of the films, The Jury of Fate, starring Mabel Taliaferro, featured her in a dual role achieved with double exposure techniques that were particularly groundbreaking for the time. In 1918, Browning returned to Hollywood, where he produced 3 more films for Metro, starring Edith Story. These early and profitable films established him as a successful director and scriptwriter. In the spring of 1918, Browning departed Metro and signed with Bluebird Photoplay Studios, a subsidiary of Carl Laemmle's Universal Pictures. This led to Browning joining Universal outright in 1919, where he would direct a series of extremely successful films starring Priscilla Dean. Dean was Universal's leading lady, known for playing tough girls. Browning directed 9 total films with Dean, including The Virgin of Stamboul in 1920, Under Two Flags in 1922, and Drifting in 1923. These films highlighted Browning's fascination with exotic foreign settings and with underworld criminal activities, which served to drive much of the action in his films. The Dean films were a resounding success, but the most fortunate outcome of those films was Browning being introduced to Lon Chaney. Chaney, of course, had already been granted the nickname of the Man of a Thousand Faces as early as 1919 for his own work at Universal. Universal's vice president at the time, boy genius Irving Thalberg, paired Browning and Chaney for the first time in The Wicked Darling in 1919. Chaney starred as Stoop Connors, a thief who forces a poor girl, played by Priscilla Dean, from the slums into a life of crime and prostitution. In 1921, Browning and Thalberg enlisted Chaney in another Dean-led super jewel, Outside the Law, in which he played the dual role of the sinister Black Mike Silva and the benevolent Ah Wing. This feature further demonstrated Browning's natural affinity for the melodramatic and grotesque. In a special effect that drew critical attention, Chaney appears to murder his own dual character counterpart through trick photography. And with Thalberg supporting their imaginative freedom, Chaney's ability and unique presence fanned the flames of Browning's passion for the extraordinary. Biographer Stuart Rosenthal remarked upon the foundation of the Browning-Chaney professional synergy by saying, "In the screen personality of Lon Chaney, Tod Browning found the perfect embodiment of the type of character that interested him. Chaney's unconditional dedication to his acting gave his characters the extraordinary intensity that was absolutely essential to the credibility of Browning's creations." Tod Browning and Lon Chaney were perfect for one another, and with the support of Irving Thalberg, it only made sense that the duo would leave Universal with him when he resigned. By the time that Thalberg was the production manager at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer in 1925, Browning and Chaney joined him at the studio. There, Browning and Chaney would release their greatest films together. Browning and Chaney made 8 critically and commercially successful feature films at MGM under the leadership of Thalberg. This period marked the zenith of both Browning's and Chaney's silent careers. Browning wrote and co-wrote the stories for 6 of the 8 productions. Screenwriter Waldemar Young, credited on 9 of Browning's MGM pictures, worked effectively with Browning. Browning's time at MGM marked the director reaching his artistic maturity as a filmmaker. The first of these MGM productions established Browning as a talented and well-regarded filmmaker in Hollywood and deepened Chaney's professional and personal influence on the director. The film was the 1925 release, The Unholy Three. The Unholy Three, premiering on May 30th, 1925, is a circus crime melodrama based upon a short story by author Tod Robbins. The circus setting was, of course, familiar to Browning, and the story revolved around a trio of ex-carnies and a pickpocket who form a jewelry theft ring. The film is an outstanding example of Browning's celebration of the bizarre, though this film didn't focus on the macabre. Most film historians consider this to be one of Browning's tamer films. Chaney doubles as Professor Echo, a sideshow ventriloquist, and as Mrs. Granny O'Grady, a cross-dressing Echo. Chaney would reprise the role in his final film, also his only talkie, a remake, The Unholy Three, in 1930. Browning would not return to direct that feature. Harry Earls, a member of the Doll family, a group of dwarf actors and performers, starred alongside Chaney as the violent and wicked Tweedledee, who poses as Granny's infant grandchild. Earls would star in Browning's Freaks in 1932 in a leading role. He also played a member of the Lollipop Guild, one of the 3 Munchkins in 1939's The Wizard of Oz. Control over another being is noted as a central theme of the film. The film's budget was $114,000 and grossed $704,000, a huge box office and critical success for the time. Chaney did not join Browning's next MGM feature. Chaney went on to star in Victor Sjöström's The Tower of Lies. Browning wrote and directed Eileen Pringle and The Unknown in 1925. The film features many of Browning's typical elements in his MGM features: carnivals, Hungarian gypsies, and seances. All of these tropes cover the melodramatic plot that involves embezzlement and swindling. Film historian Vivian Sobchak, in her book The Films of Tod Browning, notes, although fascinated by the grotesque, the deformed, and the perverse, Browning, a former magician, was a debunker of the occult and the supernatural. Indeed, Browning is more interested in tricks and illusions than the supernatural. In The Mystic, Browning is quick to reveal to his audience the illusionist fakery that serves to extract a fortune from a gullible heiress, played by Gladys Hewlett. Browning's next 3 films also starred Lon Chaney. 1926 saw the release of The Blackbird, another crime melodrama, as well as The Road to Mandalay. Chaney's character in each film, The Blackbird and Singapore Joe, are both memorable, but neither compared to his character in the duo's next film, London After Midnight. Let's take a look at some of Browning's more horror-adjacent films. Based on Browning's own tale, entitled The Hypnotist, London After Midnight is described as a drawing room murder mystery. Its macabre and gothic atmosphere resembling Robert Wine's The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. The film is another example of Browning demonstrating trickery and spectacles of spirit theater that purport to operate through the paranormal. Browning's cinematic illusions are conducted strictly through mechanical stage apparatus. No trick photography is employed. Here's a comment from Browning himself in an interview with Joan Dickey from Motion Picture Magazine from March of 1928. Mystery stories are tricky, for if they are too gruesome or horrible, if they exceed the average imagination by too much, the audience will laugh. London After Midnight is an example of how to get people to accept ghosts and other supernatural spirits by letting them turn out to be machinations of a detective. Thereby, the audience is not asked to believe the horrible impossible, but the horrible possible, and plausibility increased, rather than lessened, the thrill and chills. Lon Chaney's makeup as the man in the beaver hat is legendary. Biographer Alfred Eaker writes, Chaney's vampire is a makeup artist's delight and an actor's hell. Fishing wire looped around his blackened eye sockets, a set of painfully inserted, shark-like teeth producing a hideous grin, a ludicrous wig under a top hat, and white pancake makeup achieved Chaney's kinky look. To add to the effect, Chaney developed a misshapen and congruous walk for the character. London After Midnight received a mixed critical response, but grossed over $1 million in 1927 against a budget of $151,666.14. Browning's next film was The Show. Chaney was busy making Tell It to the Marines. The show was described as one of the most bizarre productions to emerge from silent cinema. The film is another example of Browning showcasing the carnival and sideshow setting while offering a peek behind the curtain of illusion and carnival trickery. More of that trickery would play to thrilling effect in his next film, The Unknown. The Unknown was Browning's and Chaney's next pairing, and often considered, perhaps, their finest film together. It carried the tagline, "A superb mystery thriller, unusual and startling even for a Chaney film. Lon, as the Unknown, eats, drinks, shoots a rifle, and dresses with his feet. Don't miss this startling spectacle." The Unknown is considered by some as a horror film, and it certainly frightened audiences. Although by today's standards, it would be a far cry to call it a true horror picture. Outside of Browning's central themes of crime and carnival life, this film fully realizes another of his themes: the linkage of physical deformity with sexual frustration. Here's a quote by Browning in a motion picture classic interview in 1928 regarding the film. "The story writes itself after I have conceived the characters. The Unknown came to me after the idea of a man, Alonzo, without arms. I then asked myself, what are the most amazing situations and actions that a man thus reduced could be involved? Here are Chaney's thoughts. I contrived to make myself look like an armless man, not simply to shock and horrify you, but merely to bring to the screen a dramatic story of an armless man. Chaney is joined by Joan Crawford as Nanon, the object of his affections, and Norman Carey, who had played alongside Chaney as the heroes in both The Hunchback of Notre Dame and The Phantom of the Opera. Filming took place from February 7th to March 18th, 1927, on a budget of $217,000. It was released on June 4th and grossed $847,000. Browning's and Chaney's next three films were released in 1928 and 1929. The Big City, West of Zanzibar, and Where East is East were all MGM melodramas. Each proved successful, but none grossed as much as London After Midnight, nor were as critically acclaimed as The Unknown. Still, Browning and Chaney made their indelible mark on the history of cinema together. Where East is East was Browning's final silent film, released in May of 1929. Lon Chaney, of course, passed away the following year. Upon completing Where East is East, MGM prepared to make Browning's first sound picture, The 13th Chair. As we know, the transition from silent film to talkies was more than a little bumpy. A wide dispute among classic film fans and historians alike is Browning's capability as a sound director. Some critics believe that Browning attempted to avoid dialogue at all costs in favor of visuals and effects. At the end of the day, each film speaks for itself, culminating in what is nearly unanimously considered his greatest cinematic achievement, 1932's Freaks. As we move to Browning's sound picture career, let's focus on his more noteworthy thriller and horror films. The 13th Chair is noteworthy for a few reasons. It's Browning's first sound film, based on a 1916 stage play of the same name by Bayard Taylor. The film was released in both sound and silent versions on October 19, 1929. Its cast featured some of MGM's top contract players of the time, including Conrad Nagel, Lila Hyams, and Margaret Wycherley. Bela Lugosi, the sensational star of Broadway's monumental Dracula production in 1927, was enlisted by Browning to play Inspector Del Zante, when Lon Chaney declined to star in a talking picture. This was the first of three films the pair would collaborate on, the next being Universal's Dracula in 1931, and the final being MGM's The Mark of the Vampire in 1935. Browning's next talkie was a remake of his Chaney starring 1921 silent film, Outside the Law. This remake was released by Universal Studios in August of 1930 and received comparatively poor reviews. Next up for Browning was Universal's Dracula, but we'll dive deeply into that in a few episodes. Following Dracula, Browning directed his final sound picture for Universal. Released on April 30th, 1930, Iron Man is a sports drama about a prizefighter, played by All Quiet on the Western Front leading man Lou Ayres, who is abandoned by his wife, played by Jean Harlow, due to his failing career. Following his first winning streak, his wife returns to him, but fools her husband into hiring her lover as his new boxing manager. Plenty of melodrama here, yet the film is largely ignored critically. However, it is noted that Iron Man exhibits the director's transformation into the sound era. Rather than relying on editing and visual effects, Browning moved away from his more stationary camera style toward a conspicuous use of camera movement under the influence of Karl Freund, cinematographer on Dracula, and whom many historians believe acted more of a director on that film than Browning himself. After Iron Man, Browning returned to MGM to create an unsettling piece of art that still thrills to this day. Considered his magnum opus, Freaks, released on February 12, 1932, is also Browning's most controversial film. Freaks is decades ahead of its time. A pre-code film that packed a punch that contemporary audiences didn't quite have the stomach for. Yet, as much as it horrified audiences and critics alike, they ultimately missed the entire point of the film: compassion. Here's a quote from film critic Andrew Sarris in The American Cinema, Directors and Directions, 1929 through 1968, published in 1968. Freaks may be one of the most compassionate movies ever made. Here's a review from Harrison's Reports from July 16th, 1932. Not even the most morbidly inclined could possibly find this picture to their liking. Saying it is horrible is putting it mildly. It is revolting to the extent of turning one's stomach. Anyone who considers this entertainment should be placed in the pathological ward in some hospital. Indeed, Freaks was unimaginably polarizing at the time, even for a pre-code film released the same year as Murders in the Rue Morgue and Island of Lost Souls. After the sweeping success of Dracula, Browning was lured back to MGM by a generous contract and the patronage of production manager Irving Thalberg. Browning came to Thalberg with a story proposal based on Tod Robbins' circus-themed short story entitled Spurs, published in 1926. With Dracula being such a success, Thalberg anticipated a surefire repeat. Thalberg collaborated closely with Browning in pre-production, but the director completed all shooting for the film without any interference from studio executives, thanks to Thalberg. MGM president Louis B. Mayer let his disgust for the picture be known from its inception. The film that formed was anything but a repeat of Dracula's success that Thalberg so hoped for. Freaks is a morality play at its core. It centers around the cruel seduction of a circus sideshow dwarf named Hans, played by Doll family member Harry Earls, by a beautiful trapeze artist named Cleopatra, played by Russian actress Olga Baklanova. Fans may remember Baklanova as the sensual Duchess Josiana in Universal's The Man Who Laughs, who attempted to seduce Conrad Veidt's Gwynplaine. Cleo and her lover's strongman Hercules, played by Henry Victor, scheme to murder Hans for his hefty inheritance after sexually humiliating him. The circus community of sideshow freaks form up to defend Hans, meting out their own brand of severe justice to Cleo and Hercules. Cleo is ultimately surgically transformed into a freak herself, making her one of them. Browning enlisted a cast of performers largely assembled from actual circus and carnival sideshow attractions, a community that he was intimately familiar with. Truthfully, this film was a culmination of Browning's entire creative life, from his youth as a circus performer through the entire silent era. The cast serves as dramatic and comedic players central to the story's development, and not as their respective sideshow routines as novelties. Contemporary audiences couldn't comprehend that Browning was creating a film that cast a light upon a group of outcasts that society deemed freaks, to elevate them as the genuine human beings that they were. The wedding banquet scene is perhaps one of Browning's most important of any of his films. One of us, cast a shadow across even modern cinema. The final sequence in which the freaks carry out their shocking revenge against Cleo and the revelation of her fate achieves the most palpable level of horror in any of Browning's films. Freaks was given a general release only after Thalberg excised 30 minutes of footage deemed too offensive for the general public. Freaks was an absolute disaster at the box office, earning mixed reviews from critics. Browning's reputation as a well-regarded filmmaker in Hollywood was forever tarnished. According to biographer Alfred Edgar, Freaks, in effect, ended Browning's career. Yet, modern audiences and critics have elevated the film beyond cult status. It is regarded as Browning's best work by many. Fans consider it the director's masterpiece, both due to its horror and the genuine humanity that is afforded to its cast of carnival performers. Following the failure of Freaks, Browning was assigned to produce and direct, albeit in an uncredited role, Fast Workers. The film starred Robert Armstrong of King Kong fame and Mae Clarke, who played Elizabeth in Frankenstein. The film was a box office bomb, costing MGM $360,000. Browning's next film was a return to many aspects of previous works. Mark of the Vampire involved vampires. It starred Bela Lugosi as a vampire, and is a talkie remake of his silent, Chaney-starring film, London After Midnight. The film is noteworthy, as still shots of Lugosi's character, Count Mora, are regularly mistaken for Count Dracula. Mark of the Vampire may be Browning's most atmospheric horror picture. But, like the theatrics in the film, it's all for show. I'll spare the full spoiler, as I think it's a film that should still be seen, but know that it's a notorious ending reveal. Count Mora's daughter, Luna, portrayed by Carol Borland, would go on to inspire Morticia Addams in The Addams Family. Several sources, including critic Mark Vieira and TCM writer Jeff Stafford, have claimed that MGM cut out suggestions of incest between Count Mora and Luna. Vieira further claims that the original screenplay explained that Mora was condemned to eternity as a vampire for this crime and shot himself out of guilt, which explains the unmentioned bloody wound appearing on Lugosi's right temple during the film. This was an unacceptable topic according to the standards of the Hays Code, and consequently cut from the film. However, historian Greg Mink disputes these claims, asserting that most of the cuts were either exposition or comic relief. He further claims that the alleged incest subplot was never in the shooting script and never filmed, though he acknowledges that it was likely hinted at in the original scenario written by Guy Endore. Carol Borland backed Mink's claim, pointing out that the studio would have never allowed such content to even be considered filmed. At the end of the day, it seems the incest subplot was thought about extremely early into the writing stage, and a potential line of dialogue was cut that indicated Count Mora shooting himself after strangling his daughter. Mark of the Vampire was released on April 26, 1935. Contemporary reviews were mixed to positive. Modern sentiment seemed to be more critical due to the twist ending, but you'll have to decide that for yourself. Browning's penultimate film is the science fiction thriller The Devil Doll, starring frequent collaborator Lionel Barrymore. It features some frightening moments, but is a far cry from the typical horror film of the era. The film is noteworthy for its sensational special effects, very similar to Dr. Pretorius' Little People in Jars sequence seen in Universal's The Bride of Frankenstein the year prior. It features a musical score by Franz Waxman, who scored The Bride of Frankenstein as well. The Devil Doll was released on July 10, 1936. Browning's final film was released on August 14, 1939. Miracles for Sale is a mystery thriller starring Robert Young and Florence Rice. The film did feature a scene of graphic allusion, but ultimately lost money at the box office. Critics felt it was the least Browning film, as if the studio had intervened and Browning had lost interest. By the 1940s, Browning's macabre creativity was no longer welcome in Hollywood. Sure, Universal pumped out more B-level horror pictures than one could count, but the artistry of Browning was gone. He was terminated at MGM by producer Carey Wilson after the release of Miracles for Sale. He occasionally offered screenplays to MGM, but eventually disappeared entirely from the film industry, and in 1942, retired to his home in Malibu, California. Browning's wife Alice died in 1944 from complications of pneumonia, leaving him a recluse. By that time, he had become so isolated that Variety mistakenly published an obituary that year for Browning himself, confusing his wife's death for his. In 1949, the Directors Guild of America bestowed a life membership to Browning. Now a widower, he lived alone for almost 20 years, an alcoholic recluse. In 1962, he was diagnosed with cancer of the larynx. The surgery performed to correct the condition rendered him mute. Tod Browning died alone at his Malibu home on October 6, 1962. He was interred at Angeles Rosedale Cemetery. Years after Browning's death, he received a posthumous critical reappraisal. Today, Browning is warmly referred to as the Edgar Allan Poe of cinema. His films suggest a man of compassion who had a very real relationship with the surreal nature of the world. Perhaps one of the most unique filmmakers of all time, his life before Hollywood gave the man a palette of dark and exotic storytelling capabilities that puts him into a league all his own. His characters, while wild and odd, were presented in an unprejudiced light. First and foremost, Browning was a storyteller. He was a dark poet in the early days of Hollywood that elevated the forlorn and forgotten. the freaks and criminals, the beggars and monsters. To Browning, they were familiar, and his films showcased that familiarity in a way that had never been seen before. His body of work was more than enough to entice Carl Laemmle Jr. to offer the position of director for their upcoming thriller, Dracula. Tod Browning seemed the perfect choice to bring the vampire to the silver screen. That still left the lead role to fill. There were more than a few choices that Universal considered. We all know Bela Lugosi landed the role and changed the world forever as the Count. But what of the man before that life-changing role? Join us next episode as we familiarize ourselves with Lugosi before Dracula. This episode of the Monster Archives was written and produced by me, Ian Bates. For more on the Monster Archives, including scheduling updates and news, be sure to follow @Universal Studios Monsters on Instagram. And thank you for listening.